said to me when I showed him the film of an actual exorcism, he said, well, it looks authentic, but she doesn't seem to have the classical symptoms. I said, well, doctor, what are the classical symptoms? And he said, well, her head doesn't spin completely around, and she doesn't levitate. I said, doctor, we made that up. I never heard of such symptoms. Bill Blatty could find out nothing from the church about what happened in the actual case, nor should he have found anything out about it. It's not an entertainment. It's not something they talk about. It's not something they want to boast about or reveal any details about. It's as though you had someone in your own family who was very sick, and you wouldn't want that talked about or brooded around. And that's what the attitude of the church is about possession and exorcism. However, nevertheless, it's a great story, and that's what attracted me to it. I'm not Catholic. I wasn't Catholic at the time I made it, but I made the film as a believer. I believed in the truth of this story. I believe in its truth on a different plane, on a different level. Nobody is an expert on possession and exorcism. Nobody. Father Emort was the only expert, and he's passed away. There are any number of other exorcists now, and they're training more in Rome, but there was nobody in his class. And the reason I got to meet him was because he loved this movie. He loved the Exorcist movie. And he wrote about it in his first book. A lot of guys running around tonight. It's like those guys in The Quiet Place. Those things that flit around and gobble you up, whatever they do.
No spoilers.
You see that? You see those guys flitting around? Was it the sound? Was it the sound that took it? Blatty created this story, and it's a great story, and I made the film as a believer in this story. Is that, what's that, with fries? I've been through the kitchen in this place. It's pretty massive. This is like, it's more of a restaurant than anything else.
We do show movies, but yeah.
Yeah, showing movies in a restaurant. It's a good idea.
It is, it's good. More and more people try to copy it every day.
How many of you seen The Exorcist? And you're back for more. This is the 45th year. Now that's almost half. That's almost half the existence of motion pictures. They're only about a little over 100 years old. I think the first long movie was like around 1903 or 1905.
Yeah, Great Train Robbery,
Train Robbery
1903.
was before that, they were all short films. And so The Exorcist is almost half as old as motion pictures themselves. That's hard to reconcile. I don't look that old, do I? Do I look that old? No shit! I want to hear the truth. Who thinks I look that old? Thank you. Nothing like truth, Archie.
Yeah, you got that one clap of truth.
One of the reasons The Exorcist, I think, still works is because the performances are so good that you believe it. You believe it's happening. The actors are inseparable from their roles. A lot of the films I've made as a director, you can smell the acting, you know? You can see somebody acting a part. You ever notice that? Where you look at a film and this guy's acting. This isn't real. Viviana, isn't it? You Viviana? You look like Viviana. She was here for the first show. Remember Viviana?
I do.
Doesn't she look like her?
I would have to agree with you.
Somewhat, yeah. I wouldn't judge it. So, I put a lot of the success of the movie on the cast. And the casting is like a gift from the movie God. We went through thousands of 12-year-old girls without being able to find anyone that I thought could either act this or wouldn't be psychologically damaged by doing what she's called upon to do. And there were auditions being held in about 7 or 8 cities. Of course, New York and LA, but in Chicago and other places where they had big theater companies. Austin was not one of them. But there were young girls put on tape. And I personally saw several hundred, over 300 girls. And it was fast, no way. And one day I was sitting in my office, which was at 666 Fifth Avenue in New York. I swear to God, that was the Warner Brothers headquarters then, and we edited the film there at 666 Fifth Avenue. Something poetic in that. Don't you agree?
Very much so.
T.S. Eliot or W.B. Yeats?
What?
Never mind. We'll get to that later. One day I'm in my office at 666 Fifth Avenue, and my assistant buzzes me and says, "There's a woman out here named Eleanor Blair. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's brought her daughter, Linda. Would you see her?" And I thought, sure. I remember I was sitting at my desk holding my head in my hands because we had started. Is that a personal call? Or
No, it was the driver.
What is it?
It was for the driver.
Oh, you're calling the driver?
Oh, she was texting me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I actually had to make sure I had an alibi and everything.
All right. He's ready with all the stories. Quiet place. Don't make any noise. The door opens and in walks Linda Blair. And I knew instantly that she was the one before she opened her mouth. And she had never acted before. She had done some modeling. You know, those ads you see in the newspaper sometimes for little girls' coats and dresses and stuff. She had done that. She was a straight A student in grammar school in Westport, Connecticut. She was a champion horsewoman for her age. Totally together little girl. And I just knew she was the one. Did I ever tell you guys the story of what we said at that meeting? Have you heard that? No. So she sits down and her mother is right there. And I said, "Hi, Linda." She said, "Hello." I said, "You know anything about The Exorcist?" And she said, "Yes, I read the book." I said, "Really? What is it about?" She said, "Well, it's about a little girl that gets possessed by a devil, and she does a whole bunch of bad things." And I said, well, what sort of bad things? She said, "Well, she hits her mother across the face, and she pushes a man out of her bedroom window, and she masturbates with a crucifix." And I said, I looked at her, and I looked at her mother. Her mother was smiling. So I ventured on. I said, "Do you know what that means, Linda?" She said, "What?" I said, "To masturbate." She said, "It's like jerking off, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah." The mother was still smiling. I said, have you ever done that? And she said, sure, haven't you? And I hired her. That was her audition. And I'm not joking. I knew from that she was not going to be troubled by this experience. She was totally together at the age of 12. And there wasn't one day on the set that she ever complained or, there were times like when she says some of the stuff, what's in there, and she had to say that, and I would give her the page of dialogue we were doing before she had to go and do it. And she'd look at it and she'd say, oh, I can't say this. And I said, oh, sure you can. She said, no, I can't say this. I said, yeah, you can say it. I said, look, I'm not going to use your voice. I'm going to replace your voice, so it will never be you saying it. But you have to say it so that the person who does your voice can lip sync it. So she would do it without really totally understanding a lot of what those phrases are. And I have always said, or since then, not always, 45 years now, I've said that she was a gift from the movie god, as was the rest of the cast. Jason Miller, who plays Father Karras, he was a playwright. He was not an actor. He had done some small roles in off-Broadway plays. And I saw his play, which won the Pulitzer Prize. It was called That Championship Season. It's a great play. And I met him, and he was Father Karras. He absolutely was Father Karras. And he was not an actor, and he'd never been to Hollywood. Hey, have a bite of your hamburger. It's getting cold. If you don't take some of that hamburger, I may snatch it. Nice looking fries, too. How are the pizzas here? Is that the chef? So yes, in my view, the most important thing is the cast in this picture. And then we worked very diligently to bring Mr. Blatty's novel to the screen as he wrote it. And that's what you're going to see, many of you again, tonight. Do any of you have any questions before I turn this over to the projectionist about this film? Is your hand up? Yes. No? If anyone has any questions they'd like to add, yes, sir.
Can you talk about the casting of Max Von Sydow?
He was my first choice initially. Max Von Sydow was my first and only choice. He had made all of these great films for the Swedish director, Ingmar Bergman. And whereas a lot of the other people I found, Ellen Burstyn was not a star, she was a supporting actress. Miller had never acted, Linda Blair had never acted. Lee J. Cobb and Von Sydow were two of the greatest actors in the world. And we just went after them and got them because of their body of work. But I cast other people who had no body of work, and it all somehow came together. And then we worked on the special effects for months. They're all done in the camera. Quiet place.
That's a really good callback, anytime.
See, it's because you're making noise. Silence is beautiful. There's a lot of silence in this movie. There's a lot of loud noise followed by absolute silence. And I mean absolute. Even when you hear silence in most films, there's still bias running. The magnetic tape is still running, or the digital is playing, you know, some kind of room tone or something, not in The Exorcist. When it goes dead silent, it's the complete absence of sound. I just cut to white leader, there's no sound. But sound was very important in the making of the film as well. I always view the soundtrack as completely different from the picture. And the soundtrack of The Exorcist was done, with the exception of the dialogue, but all the sounds, the music, the little subliminal things were done after the fact. And I was creating like a dramatic radio show. And the film, its story and its possibilities enabled me to be able to do that, to create. If you sometimes just listen, especially in quiet moments, you will hear things that you probably didn't hear before. There are a lot of subliminal sounds peppered throughout the film. And so listen for those, if you will. The sound is very important to this picture. You guys don't have anything to add?
No, there's a question way in the back.
How can you tell? I can't see a damn thing.
I've been doing this a lot. My eyes have kind of.
Yeah.
You in the back.
Could you talk about the music a little bit? I thought
Yeah.
about the score was absolutely perfect.
It's a very interesting thing, the score. That'll take me out. Because originally I used, when you make up the score of a movie, before you work with a composer, you use what is known as a temp track, a temporary track, made up of existing music. Stanley Kubrick used Thus Spake Zarathustra by Richard Strauss as the opening of 2001. But he never meant to use it. It was just as a guide to the composer that he hired. I forget his name. Does anyone remember it?
Alex North.
What? Alex North. Right. And he hired Alex North to write a score, and Alex North wrote a score, and Kubrick, it obviously wasn't as good as Thus Spake Zarathustra by Richard Strauss.
Bum, 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 ba-dum.
Fantastic. And that was Temp Track that he used to score. I had Temp Track in The Exorcist. And I took the film, once I finished it, to the greatest living composer of film music at the time. Who was that? Bernard Herrmann. Bernard Herrmann wrote the score for Citizen Kane, Psycho, Taxi Driver, some of the greatest films ever made, and radio programs and stage. He was the greatest composer in his day of film music. He had worked a number of times with Alfred Hitchcock, and Hitchcock rejected his last two scores for Marnie and Torn Curtain. He rejected Herrmann's scores, and Herrmann moved out of the United States. He moved to England. And I took a work print of The Exorcist to London, and I ran it for Bernard Herrmann, who was a salty old guy from the Bronx. And I waited as he came out of the screening room at the home of the William Morris Agency, which had at one time been the home of the great classical music composer George Friedrich Handel. Of course, he wrote Handel's Messiah, which one or two of you may be familiar with. Those of you who are not sitting in front of a bowl of popcorn. Thanks, Dan. And I took the film to London and played it for Herrmann. And he came out of the screening room And his first words to me were, I might be able to save this piece of shit. He said, but what you gotta do is you gotta get rid of that first scene in the fucking desert. Because you got a scene in the desert. I don't know what the hell that scene is. Nobody will know what you're talking about. You probably won't get rid of it because it must have cost you a bundle to shoot it. But it's terrible. It's no good. Start the picture at Georgetown. And I said, well, all right. And then he said, look, kid, leave the picture with me. And when I'm finished, I'll mail you a score. I said, you mail me a score? Yeah. I said, so you don't want my input at all? He said, hey, kid, how many pictures have you directed? Do you know how many films I've written the music for? No, it was countless. And they were all great, and I loved them, which is why I went to him. He said, so don't tell me. I said, could I ask you a question? What do you think you would do with the score? Would you do any different from this Temp score I played for you, which was all contemporary at the time classical music, chamber music, by composers? Nobody who has this will know the names of any of those composers. Their brains are addled with this stuff. They look like this. I just had some downstairs. No, I'm gonna put it. That's all right. It's pretty good. He said, well, you know, there's a church just outside of London. It's called St. Giles Cripplegate. He said, they have the greatest church organ I've ever seen or heard. And he said, I would record a score in that church. And I said, you want to use a church organ in The Exorcist? He said, yeah. I stood up and shook his hand and I said, thank you for letting me meet an interesting person. And I left. And he was and is, in my opinion, the greatest composer of film music who ever lived. And I rejected him because I didn't hear it that way. So I then took the picture, someone threw out his name, Lalo Schifrin, who I knew. Was it you?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I took the film to Lalo Schifrin, who I knew. I was living in Chicago. I was born in Chicago, and he used to come through there a lot with the Dizzy Gillespie Quintet. Lalo was the pianist from Argentina. Great Latin jazz pianist. And we got to know each other while he was touring with the Gillespie Band. And so I took the film to him. He had gone to Hollywood first and become a successful composer. He wrote the score for Bullet and Mission Impossible and a whole bunch of great stuff too. Different from Herman, but great, little jazz oriented. But I played for him the Temp tracks as well. And I said, Lalo, this is the kind of thing I want. I don't want melody or rhythm, which is what you specialize in. I want chamber music, but atonal, like a cold hand on the back of your neck. You feeling it? You get what I'm saying? I wanted music like a cold hand on the back of your neck. He said, I get it. So I went to the recording session, and there were 90 guys, 90 musicians. And all the sections were electrified. Electric brass, electric drums, electric violins. It was all electrified. It was around the time that Bob Dylan had just gone electric, and Don Ellis, who did the French Connection score, that was all electronic music, electric. And electric was happening. Weather report, you know, I mean, okay. And there's 90 electrified musicians. And they start to play, and it was wall-to-wall noise. It was just loud and pounding drums. Everybody was playing. And the musicians have a habit at a scoring session that when they finish a cue, they all tap on their instruments. The violins, they all tap on it as applause for the composer-conductor. And they all did this. And I was sitting there dying. And he did 3 cues, and I went over to Lalo, and I said, Lalo, this isn't making. He said, what's wrong? I said, it's too loud, it's too noisy, and I have a lot of sound effects and stuff, and this will bury all of it. He said, well, let's go in the control room and listen to it. We go in to listen to a playback, and they start playing it back, and he went over to the master pot, and he just turned it down, so it sounded like 90 guys playing lower. And I canceled the session. I canceled it, and Warner Brothers thought I was crazy. We had no score. And I used, to get around to your question, the temp score. The stuff that I took off of existing recordings. And that's the music track. With the exception of one piece. I was looking for something that sounded vaguely like Brahms' lullaby, like a child's motif, played on a solo instrument like the piano. You know how Brahms' lullaby goes?
I don't know.
Can anyone hum? It goes like this. Ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, da-da-dum. That's Brahms' lullaby. And I wanted to sound like that. And I went in to see the music director at Warner's, and I said, is there anything around like that, like a guy playing a solo? He said, I know what you're talking about. Like RJ just said. He did just say that, precisely that. That's what the music is. He said, go in that room over there. There's a bunch of recordings that foreign record companies send to us to see if Warner Brothers wants to distribute them in the United States. And I went in there, and these were called demo records. They were made by very small companies or individuals on a big round platter. They were this round. 33 1/3, but not the size of an LP. They were almost double the size of an LP, played on an oversized turntable. And I start to listen to this stuff, and nothing was working, nothing. And I'm just throwing this stuff on these turntables like pancakes, on and off, and on and off, and nothing. And I spent 3 days doing this because I didn't know where to look for this. And then I came to a recording sent in by a new company called Virgin Records, brand new record company. And it was their first release in England, where it did nothing, called Tubular Bells. And they had sent this in to see if Warner's wanted to release it in the United States, and they didn't. And I only wanted to use it a couple of times, just like salt and pepper, you know? Little flavoring here and there. You first hear it when Ellen Burstyn's walking down a street in Georgetown during the day. And I played this, and I went out and I took it to the guy from Warner Music, and I said, this is it. This is exactly what I'm looking for. I mean, exactly. Now, it has turned out to be the all-time best-selling single. 17 million recordings of just that song. Forget how many albums Mike Oldfield has put out with it. And Richard Branson, who started Virgin Records, says in his autobiography, it was my use of that song in The Exorcist that made his company. And I had no idea who either of them were or what the hell this was. And right after I get out of that music, in the 2 or 3 places that I've used it, at the beginning, the end, and then it's buried in the middle somewhere, right after that, a guy comes on and starts narrating. It's a narration record. A guy is narrating. Has anyone heard it? The whole stupid thing? A guy comes on and starts talking about the sound that different gongs make when they strike a bell. And he's narrating in a very distinctly upper-class British voice. And I get out of it right there. And that, you know, when most people hear that music, they think of The Exorcist. And it's called a theme for The Exorcist. And I picked it off a pile of stuff. Again, a gift from the movie God.
That's a good sentence to end on. A gift from the movie God. That's in the music.
Cheers. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming out tonight to see a 45-year-old film. It's a pleasure to be back in Austin at one of the great Alamo draft houses, and I mean that. You know that most of what comes out of my mouth is bullshit. But I'm serious about that. I love what Tim Lee and his crew and RJ have done in building the Alamo as a really unique movie-going experience, and it is unique. We don't have anything like it in Los Angeles. There's some copies of it, but they don't make it.
We'll get there. We're almost
I know
there.
you're building one in LA, in downtown LA. But I always, you know, I could be laying in bed right now. But I always like to come over to an Alamo. And when you guys said, would I come out and introduce these 2 films, I made it a point to do that because it's always a great audience. And it's a great experience. And I want to thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you again, Blair, for coming out. I usually say enjoy the movie, experience The Exorcist.
Mike, you're sick. God bless, guys.